There is a moment in the life of every empire that never makes it into speeches, textbooks, or official history. It is the moment when the system quietly stops working as designed, but continues to exist out of habit, reputation, and belief. From the outside, nothing appears broken. Institutions remain in place, power still projects outward, the currency still circulates. But internally, something fundamental has shifted. The empire has crossed a line it cannot uncross. This line is not political. It is not cultural. It does not depend on ideology, values, or intentions. It is economic, structural, and mathematical. And once it is crossed, history shows no clear example of a global empire fully reversing course and returning to long-term dominance. Adjustments happen. Delays happen. Sometimes even periods of apparent recovery happen. But the trajectory does not reset. It only bends temporarily before continuing in the same direction. Let me elaborate on this invisible line right from the start, because understanding it requires us to peel back layers of what we think we know about power and decline. Imagine a vast machine humming along perfectly for centuries. Gears turn smoothly. Output exceeds input. Everyone marvels at its efficiency. Then, one day, without alarms or breakdowns, the machine starts consuming its own parts to keep moving. It looks the same from afar, but inside, the fuel is now the structure itself. That is the line. Empires cross it not through a bang, but a whisper. And once crossed, the math of sustainability flips irreversibly. We will explore why through history's greatest examples, drawing out every detail, every parallel, every lesson that modern powers should heed. Empires do not collapse because they suddenly become incompetent. They collapse because their scale eventually outgrows their capacity to sustain themselves. Power accumulates faster than restraint. Commitments expand faster than production, and obligations compound faster than the system's ability to honor them. This imbalance is not dramatic at first. In fact, it is often invisible to those living through it. Decline does not announce itself. It blends into normal life. Day by day, leaders make rational choices. Citizens enjoy the fruits of past glory. Economists chart minor fluctuations. No one sees the slow erosion of foundations. But over decades, the gap widens. Revenues from productive enterprises shrink relative to the ballooning costs of empire. Armies, alliances, infrastructure, welfare, debt service. What begins as a manageable deficit becomes a structural chasm. Pause and reflect. How many empires boasted of their peak prosperity right before the fall? One of the most persistent myths about collapse is that it is sudden and obvious, that empires fall because of a single catastrophic event, a war, a revolution, a crisis. People love these stories. Simple villains, heroic last stands, dramatic finales. But in reality, those events are rarely the cause. They are the trigger that exposes a system that was already hollow inside. The wood was rotten long before the storm hit. Collapse begins long before it becomes visible. It begins when the internal logic of the system changes from productive to extractive, from sustainable to compensatory. Productive logic builds wealth. Invest in farms, roads, education, and reap compounding returns. Extractive logic extracts wealth. Tax harder, print money, borrow from tomorrow to pay today. This shift is gradual, masked by inertia and denial. Consider the early days of any empire. Resources flow in from conquests or trade surpluses. Leaders build aqueducts, universities, navies. Each investment multiplies output. The virtuous cycle spins faster. But maturity brings complexity. Borders stretch to natural limits, oceans, mountains, rival powers. Maintaining far-flung provinces costs more than they yield. Armies stationed abroad consume local surpluses. Bureaucracies multiply to manage the sprawl. Suddenly, the center must subsidize the periphery. The cycle reverses. At the beginning of an empire's rise, growth is organic. Expansion creates new capacity. Investment leads to productivity. Trade generates surplus. The system produces more than it consumes, and that surplus funds power. Think of young Rome. Plundering Carthage fills the treasury, slaves till fields, tribute pours in. Or young Britain. Colonies ship cotton, sugar, gold, factories churn goods for export, surplus everywhere. But over time, as dominance increases, the nature of growth changes. Expansion becomes maintenance, investment becomes obligation, trade becomes dependency. The system starts using future output to sustain present conditions. Colonies demand protection. Allies expect aid. Citizens demand entitlements funded by past glories. This is the moment where the math quietly turns against it. Compound interest on debts outpaces compound growth on production. The denominator shrinks while the numerator explodes. Let us pause here and think deeply. Have the United States or China already crossed this invisible line? Statistics from historians like those studying imperial lifespans show empires fall on average after about 250 years of dominance. Rome, over 500 years total, but peak dominance waned after 200. Britain, 200 years of naval supremacy. The pattern holds. History spares no one, no matter the technology or ideology. What makes today's powers think they are exempt? Let us dive into the first case study. The Roman Empire illustrates this process with remarkable clarity. Let us break it down step by step, year by year where possible, to see the slow poison at work. Rome's rise was fueled by conquest, integration, and infrastructure. New territories provided resources, labor, and taxes. Roads connected markets, over 250,000 miles of them by peak. Cities facilitated trade, hundreds blooming across Gaul, Hispania, North Africa. Law stabilized commerce with uniform weights, measures, and contracts. For centuries, Rome's growth reinforced itself. The treasury overflowed from spoils. After Actium in 31 BC, Augustus had so much gold he reminted currency at higher standards. But as the empire reached its geographic limits around 100 AD, Rhine, Danube, Sahara, the logic shifted. Expansion no longer generated net returns, it generated costs. Legions still had to be paid. 600,000 soldiers by 200 AD, costing 50% of the budget. Borders still had to be defended against Parthians, Germans, Scots. Administration still had to be maintained, bureaucrats from Britain to Syria demanding salaries. But new conquests no longer offset these expenses. Dacia, under Trajan in 106 AD, was the last big win, yielding gold but at huge human cost. After that, stagnation. The empire began funding stability rather than growth. This distinction is critical. Funding growth creates future capacity, like building aqueducts that irrigate for centuries. Funding stability consumes it, like paying barbarians to not invade year after year. To manage the growing gap between costs and revenues, Rome altered its currency. This was not done recklessly or ignorantly. It was done gradually, deliberately, and with justification. Nero, in 64 AD, debased the denarius slightly after the Great Fire, shaving 10% silver to rebuild. Trajan followed for Dacian wars. By Severus, in 200 AD, silver content dropped from 95% to 50%. Each reduction was small enough to seem harmless, maybe 5 to 10% at a time. Each adjustment bought time, funding legions or grain doles. But collectively, over 200 years, the denarius went from 95% silver, 4 grams pure, to just 5% under Gallienus in the 260s. Prices quadrupled by 200 AD, then skyrocketed 1,000% by 300 AD. Inflation did not destroy Rome overnight. It changed behavior, subtly at first. Farmers hoarded good coins, melting them down. Merchants demanded payment in kind, barter over bad money. Incentives to produce vanished. Why grow wheat if prices double yearly? Urban mobs rioted for free bread, funded by printing. It encouraged hoarding and speculation. Landlords speculated on villas while fields lay fallow. It eroded the social contract. Legionaries mutinied for pay raises. Provinces rebelled over taxes. The devaluation of the denarius was like an unstoppable credit card that consumes your monthly salary. Interest piling on interest until bankruptcy looms. Barbarian invasions drained the treasury further, Goths sacking Athens in 267 AD, while emperors like Aurelian spent fortunes buying them off. Slavery, once a boon, collapsed tax revenues. Slaves do not pay taxes, and freedmen evaded them, starving the state. Rome survived for generations after this shift. Another century of chaos until Diocletian's reforms in 284 AD, which tried price controls and worse, debasement. That survival is often mistaken for resilience. In reality, it was inertia. The empire existed because people believed it existed, senators in villas, provincials paying lip service. But its capacity to respond to shocks diminished. The crisis of the 3rd century, 50 years of civil wars, 26 claimants to the throne, invasions everywhere. When pressures increased, whether from internal unrest like the Bagaudae peasant revolts or external threats like the Sassanids, the system no longer had the flexibility it once did. Collapse was not a moment like 476 AD with Romulus Augustulus. It was a process that had already run its course internally from the debasements of the 2nd century onward. The West fragmented into barbarian kingdoms. The East limped on as Byzantium, a shadow. What can we learn from Rome's 300-year slide? First, small fiscal tweaks compound destructively. Second, military overstretch hollows the core. Provinces like Britain revolted in 410 AD, tired of paying for absent protection. Third, loss of productive incentives kills from within. Modern parallels abound, but let us move to the next empire. Centuries later, the British Empire followed a strikingly similar path, despite vast differences in technology, culture, and governance. Britain's dominance rested not on conquest alone, but on finance, trade, and naval power. The Royal Navy ruled the waves, over 200 ships of the line by 1815. The pound sterling became the world's primary reserve currency because Britain was the center of global commerce. The City of London financed railroads in America, mines in Africa, cotton mills everywhere. Trust in British institutions, Parliament, courts, Bank of England, made British debt desirable, with yields lower than anyone else's. This allowed Britain to fund expansion cheaply and efficiently. Colonies cost little up front when locals paid taxes. But reserve currency status is not a reward. It is a responsibility. It requires discipline, restraint, and productive depth. Britain had it in the 19th century. Industrial Revolution output soared, textiles 50% of world exports, coal king. Yet over time, Britain's global commitments grew faster than its domestic productive base. Maintaining naval supremacy, two-power standard post-1889, cost 30% of budget. Colonial administration, India alone drained millions yearly. International stability, guaranteeing Belgian neutrality, Egyptian debts. World War I accelerated this imbalance dramatically. Britain entered as creditor with £4 billion gold reserves, exited as debtor with £7 billion war debt to America. 25% of men mobilized, industry retooled for shells, not ships. Gold standard suspended, 1914. After the war, Britain faced a choice that every declining empire faces: adjust downward and accept a reduced role, or attempt to preserve status through financial engineering. Britain chose preservation, disastrously. In 1925, Winston Churchill returned to gold standard at pre-war parity, $4.86 per pound. Noble intent, restore prestige, attract capital. Reality, pound overvalued 10 to 20%, exports uncompetitive. Coal, steel, shipbuilding collapsed. Unemployment hit 20% in North. General strike, 1926. Debt service ate 40% of budget. World War II eliminated any remaining illusion. Britain borrowed another £3 billion. Total debt, 250% GDP by 1945. U.S. Lend-Lease propped it up. Then Bretton Woods made dollar king. Empire was no longer asset. India cost £1 billion yearly to hold. Decolonization rushed. India, 1947. Not generosity, necessity. Suez Crisis, 1956, exposed weakness. Eisenhower forced retreat. Pound devalued 30% in 1967. Abandoning gold in 1931, full sterling crises by 1976. IMF bailout. Britain adapted to junior partner role, but empire never returned. Key lessons. Reserve status breeds complacency. Live off seigniorage till it flips to burden. Wars compound debt exponentially. Financial tricks delay but amplify pain. Sound familiar? The Soviet Union represents the same pattern compressed into a shorter time frame, 70 years, from 1917 revolution to 1991 dissolution. Unlike Rome or Britain, the Soviet system did not rely on markets to allocate resources. It relied on central planning via Gosplan, 5-year plans dictating steel quotas, tractor output. This allowed rapid industrialization. 1928 to 1940, GDP quadrupled. Heavy industry base for World War II victory. Military expansion, nukes by 1949, Warsaw Pact. But it also suppressed innovation. No price signals meant misallocation. Efficiency nil, feedback loops broken. For a time, the system functioned because it mobilized enormous resources toward defined goals: space race, canals, dams. Stalin's purges ensured compliance. But over time, rigidity replaced adaptability. Military spending consumed an extraordinary share, 25% GDP by 1980s versus 6% US. Global commitments multiplied: Cuba, Vietnam, Angola proxies. Consumer production lagged miserably: toothpaste shortages, lines for bread. The system could meet quotas, fake stats padded, but not needs. Black markets thrived. Oil revenues masked weaknesses. 1970s boom, petrodollars funded imports. Exports hit $20 billion yearly. When oil prices fell in 1986 from $30 to $10 per barrel, system lost buffer. Hard currency dried up, could not buy grain. Underlying inefficiencies exposed. Factories at 30% capacity, agriculture 25% U.S. yield per acre. Gorbachev's perestroika too late, glasnost unleashed republics. Debt to West, $70 billion. Coup 1991 failed, USSR dissolved. Collapse sudden because flexibility gone, no markets to pivot. System no capacity absorb shocks. Compressed timeline, same endpoint. These cases are often treated as historical curiosities, each explained by unique circumstances. Barbarians for Rome, Nazis for Britain, Reagan for USSR. But when viewed together, a clear structure emerges. Empires do not fail because of specific events. They fail because they reach a point where their complexity, commitments, and costs exceed their ability to generate real economic value. Administrative bloat, Rome's 30,000 officials, Britain's colonial service, 100,000. Entitlements, Roman bread and circuses, British welfare post-war. Alliances, NATO, Quad today. This is the economic limit every empire eventually encounters. It is reached when a system, during periods of relative stability, requires constant borrowing, monetary expansion, or external financing simply to function. Not to grow, not to expand, just to operate. United States in 2025, debt $36 trillion, 130% GDP. Interest $1 trillion yearly, more than defense. Fed balance sheet $7 trillion post-COVID. China, local government debt 300% GDP. Evergrande bubble burst, ghost cities. Ray Dalio's big cycles, rise via productivity, peak via debt, decline via deleverage, rhyme perfectly. History does not repeat, but it rhymes, as Mark Twain said. What makes this limit so dangerous is that it does not feel like a limit. It feels like normal governance. Budgets passed yearly, United States $6 trillion omnibus. Debt issued seamlessly, $2 trillion treasuries auctioned weekly. Currency managed by Powell, Lagarde. Markets respond bullishly on dips. Each decision appears rational in isolation. Stimulus checks buy votes, subsidies prop industries. Each delay feels justified. This time is different. AI boom, green transition. The system continues functioning, reinforcing belief in perpetuity. This belief is final stabilizer. $60% reserves because safe. Empires do not collapse when weak, when confidence breaks. Confidence, not vague psychology, material force, determines debt rollover. United States 10-year yields spike. Currency acceptance. BRICS de-dollarize. Institutions obeyed. Debt ceiling fights. 2008 GFC tested. $9 trillion QE passed. Next shock? Reason limit ignored. Structural incentives. Leaders rewarded short-term re-election on growth stats. Institutions for expansion. Pentagon budgets balloon. Population's consumption. Stimulus addiction. Restraint costs immediate. Austerity riots. Benefits delayed. Fiscal health in 2040. Bias postponement universal. Every empire believes more time. Flexibility via tech, AI, renewables. Tools, crypto, CBDCs. Intelligence, think tanks. Innovation, Silicon Valley. History informative, not binding. Past mistakes avoided. Not arrogance, necessity. Admit decline, legitimacy crumbles. Stop tumbles, allies flee. Once crossed, outcomes narrow. Growth intervention dependent, QE infinity. Debt compounds faster income. United States 10% rates double service. Monetary routine, negative yields Japan. Shocks demand bigger responses. Y2K nothing, COVID $6 trillion. System loses stress absorption. Small disruptions, SVB 2023, outsized bailouts. Stability, fragile glass. Collapse rarely dramatic. Starts confidence loss. Currency flight, Weimar wheelbarrows slow. Capital safety, gold surges. Trade shifts, yuan swaps. Financing rises, inverted curve. Polarization, populists win. Institutions falter, default brink. Unthinkable, plausible, inevitable. Consistency, unsettling. Cultures, Latin, Anglo, Slavic. Tech, swords, steam, nukes. Ideologies, pagan, liberal, communist. Same math, limit not leadership, morality fail. Scale, complexity, consequence. Systems grow till reality constrains. Adjustment unavoidable. Restructuring, breakup. Understanding not timeline prediction. History conditions-based. Conditions met, debt GDP 150% plus, interest greater than growth, reserve erosion. Outcomes likely. Moment varies. Rome, centuries. USSR, instant. Direction, down. Every global dominant thought, permanence solved. Discovered illusion. Power not static. Regenerated by output. Slows, liability. Lesson, not imminent doom. Systems limited, non-negotiable. Cannot consume greater than produce forever. Borrow, consequence eternal. Commitments need capacity. History punishes imbalance, not ambition. Fall, mistaking scale, sustainability. Difference clear, too late. Future patterns written. History, patient teacher. Understand systems break before. Watch patterns. Debt clocks tick. Reserve shares slip. Shocks loom. Awareness power. Expand further. Ottoman Empire parallel. Peak 1600. Janissaries bloated. Inflation from America's silver. Lost Balkans incrementally. Spanish Empire. Gold curse. Inflation 400%, 1500 to 1600. Fleets sunk defending Philippines. Mongol successor states. Overextension, fractured khanates. Pattern universal. For United States, $36 trillion debt trajectory. Social Security Medicare, $100 trillion unfunded. Military, 800 bases, $900 billion budget. Allies, Ukraine, Taiwan, drain. Dollar weaponized. Russia, sanctions backfire. China, demographics crash. Youth unemployment 20%. Property 30%. GDP bubble. Both crossed? Solutions. Rare reversals. Venice adapted trade pivot. But globals? Shrink gracefully. Unlikely politics. Or innovate wildly. Productivity miracle. History odds low. Final call. Patterns repeat till grasped. Eyes open. Subscribe deeper dives. United States debt deep dive next. Comment. Your empire timeline? Share, engage, prepare.